My name is Brian, and a few weeks ago I moved into a small apartment in an old building downtown. It was all I could afford at the time, and the location seemed perfect for someone like me, looking for a bit of independence. The building, probably 100 years old or more, still carried the charm of its era, with heavy wooden doors and large windows that creaked when opened. The smell of aged wood and mildew was almost permanent in the hallways, but I liked the atmosphere, despite its tired appearance. The first week was quiet. I worked during the day and come back at night, usually with a book or a movie to keep me distracted. The neighbors were distant, mostly composed of elderly people or students who, like me, preferred to stay in their own corners. Nothing out of the ordinary. It was on a Tuesday night when things started to change. I was sitting in the living room, reading a book under dim lights, when I noticed something out the window. It was a figure, standing on the sidewalk outside the building, right under the streetlight. I couldn't see the face, the shadow of the hood covered it, but I knew it was looking directly at my window. I watched for a moment, wondering what that person was doing there. Maybe waiting for someone? But as the minutes passed, they didn't move. I stood there, frozen, until I decided to step away, trying to convince myself it was just a coincidence. Still, the discomfort was undeniable. The next night, when I got home, I found myself looking directly at the same spot on the sidewalk. To my dismay, the figure was there again. The same person, unmoving, staring directly at my window. What at first seemed like a coincidence quickly began to unsettle me. They didn't move, and even as the hours passed, they remained there. I tried to ignore it in the following days. I avoided looking out the window, keeping the curtains closed at night. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. Deep down, I knew they were still there. The worst part was that no one else seemed to notice. I even tried mentioning it to a neighbor, an elderly lady who lived in the apartment next door, but she just gave me a polite smile, as if she didn't want to get involved. After a week, fear started to take hold of me. I decided I had to do something. On a rainy night, when the figure appeared again, I put on my coat and went down to the street. My heart was racing, but I knew I needed to confront them. However, when I reached the sidewalk, the figure was gone. It was as if they had never been there. The ground was soaked, but there were no footprints, no sign of anyone. My thoughts started to spiral out of control. Was I imagining things? The obsession with the figure grew with each passing day. I started avoiding going out at night. I felt a constant presence, as if someone was always lurking, watching me. One night, something inside me gave in. I decided I needed to find out more about that place. The building had a strange aura, as if it held ancient secrets. I spent hours in the city library, researching any information I could find about the building. That's when I discovered something that chilled me to the bone. Almost 50 years ago, a man who lived in my apartment died under mysterious circumstances. He was found lying on the sidewalk, beneath my window, as if he had jumped. The newspaper at the time reported that, in the weeks before his death, he had started telling friends that a figure appeared every night, standing on the sidewalk, staring at his window. The description was eerily familiar. As I read this, a wave of panic hit me. Could I be living the same cycle of terror? I tried to convince myself that it was just a morbid coincidence, but his presence on the sidewalk, night after night, told me otherwise. A few days later, the real terror began. One night, I was woken up by a noise. The clock read 3:17 a.m. At first, I thought it was just the wind rattling the old windows, but then I heard it again. It was the sound of footsteps. Slow, almost calculated, echoing down the hallway outside my apartment. I sat up in bed, paralyzed. The footsteps grew closer, as if someone was walking directly toward my door. I got up and quietly walked to the door. I peeked through the peephole, expecting to see one of my neighbors, maybe coming home late. But the sight that awaited me made my blood run cold. There, in the empty, dimly lit hallway, was the same figure I had seen every night on the sidewalk. He stood still, staring directly at my door, as if he knew I was there, just on the other side. His hood still covered his face, but I could feel the intensity of his gaze. For a moment, I considered opening the door, confronting him once and for all, but fear consumed me. I took a step back, feeling my heart race. The sound of the doorknob slowly turning made me tremble. The figure was trying to get in. At that moment, every instinct inside me screamed for me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I stood there, watching as the doorknob continued to turn, until finally the door began to slowly open, revealing a darkness that seemed to suck in all the light around it. The door opened just enough for a rush of cold air to seep into the apartment. Terror overwhelmed my senses. The figure didn't cross the threshold, but its presence was overpowering. The hallway seemed to have been swallowed by an oppressive darkness, and my body froze to the point where it felt impossible to breathe. I tried to take control of the situation, to reach for my phone, but my hand was trembling so much that it slipped from my grasp and fell to the floor. The sound of the phone hitting the ground echoed through the room, but strangely, it was as if no sound crossed the void between me and the figure at the door. Then, in a movement that made me stagger back, the figure took a step forward. Its feet entered the apartment, and for the first time, I noticed something disturbing. Its shadow seemed to move unnaturally. There was no sound at all. It was as if he were a specter, a part of the darkness itself, moving on its own. Suddenly, the figure stopped. I stood there, motionless, waiting for the worst. And then, without warning, it vanished. The silence that followed was almost as terrifying as its presence. I rushed to the door and slammed it shut, locking it multiple times, as if that could somehow prevent its return. That night marked a turning point. The following hours passed in a state of constant vigilance, sitting on the couch with all the lights on, listening to every sound, every little creak in the building. But the figure didn't return at that moment. The shadows seemed to pulse around me, but the temporary relief that, at least for that night, I was safe allowed me to finally fall asleep near dawn. In the days that followed, the strange occurrences became more frequent. Lights flickered without reason. Objects moved from their places, even though I was sure of where I had left them. Even the bathroom mirror started showing odd smudges, as if a hand had pressed against the glass from the other side. More terrifying still, the figure on the sidewalk remained, even during the day, appearing at unexpected moments, sometimes in the middle of a crowd, but always returning to its original position by nightfall. My mind was on the verge of collapse. My hours of sleep grew shorter, and the constant terror began affecting my work routine. I knew I was in a downward spiral. I had to understand what was happening. I decided to seek help, but I didn't know where to start. Psychologists and therapists wouldn't believe such a surreal story. I spoke again to the elderly neighbor, Mary. Her eyes were tired, as if she carried the weight of many lives. When I mentioned the figure at the window, her face darkened. "You've seen it, haven't you?" she asked, her voice low and fearful. She told me that the building had a dark history, but no one liked to talk about it. People who saw the visitor didn't last long there. Many moved away, and those who stayed, well, some simply disappeared. She mentioned a name that chilled me to the bone. Daniel Cormack. That was the name of the man who, 50 years ago, fell from the window of my apartment. Convinced that what was happening to me was directly connected to this man, I decided to dig deeper. I went back to the library and found more detailed reports about Daniel. He had also spoken of the man who appeared at night, and his final days were filled with bizarre events, similar to mine. There were also references to an ancient protection ritual he had attempted, but the article didn't explain the details. One thing was clear. Daniel believed the visitor wasn't just a haunting, but something much older and far more dangerous. One night, I decided I had to face the visitor. I had nothing left to lose. My mental state was already shattered, and continuing to live that way was impossible. I took a protection amulet that Mary had given me and sat facing the door, waiting for his presence. The wait was agonizing. Every sound, every shadow seemed to carry the weight of impending terror. And around 3 a.m., he returned. This time, I didn't need to look through the peephole. The door began to tremble, as before, and the sound of something dragging through the hallway grew louder. The doorknob turned slowly, like a repeated nightmare, but this time I didn't back down. When the door opened again, I was ready. The air became heavy, and the darkness that accompanied him seemed to distort reality. I felt a crushing pressure on my lungs, as if the air was being sucked out of the room. Then, for the first time, I saw him clearly. His face was obscured by an almost liquid darkness, and his eyes were two hollow voids that seemed to suck in the light around them. He moved slowly, as if time around him worked differently, and when his presence filled the room, my entire body froze in pure terror. The amulet in my hand began to heat up, burning my skin, but I didn't let it distract me. I remembered what Mary had said. He wasn't a ghost. He was an ancient entity, an echo of something that should never have existed in this world. With all the courage I had left, I yelled at him to back off. The voice that came out of me was weaker than I expected, but to my surprise, the figure stopped. For a moment that felt eternal, we stood there, him and me, separated by a few meters, locked in a silent battle of wills. Then, without warning, he dissolved into the darkness of the room, as if he had never been there. Some time later, the apparitions stopped. I no longer saw the figure on the sidewalk, and the apartment gradually returned to its original state, silent and empty. Mary, however, was no longer there. I learned she had moved away without warning, leaving only a short note on my door. Some secrets are better left buried. Although the nightmare was over, something inside me had changed. I still find myself looking out the window at night, expecting to see him again. Even knowing he's gone, a part of me will always believe he's still there, waiting. Because that's how it works with visitors. They never really leave.